Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries, and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments. The story of Haile Selassie, Ethiopia's last emperor, is one of resilience, ambition, and transformation. From his rise in Addis Ababa to his exile during Italy's invasion, Selassie's journey reflects the challenges of leadership amidst global upheaval. This documentary explores his legacy, shedding light on an era that shaped modern Ethiopia. Part 1. The Early Years. Haile Selassie, born as Tafari Makonnen on July 23, 1892, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, came into the world during a period of great transformation in the Ethiopian Empire. His father, Ras Makonnen, was a trusted governor and close ally of Emperor Menelik II, playing a significant role in shaping young Tafari's life and future. Tafari's mother, Yeshimbet Ali, passed away when he was just a child, leaving his father to take charge of his upbringing. As the son of a prominent figure, Tafari grew up in an environment that exposed him to the complexities of leadership, governance, and diplomacy from an early age. Ras Makonnen ensured that Tafari received an education far superior to that of most Ethiopian children of the time. While traditional Ethiopian education emphasized religious teachings, Tafari's learning included secular subjects such as history, geography, and languages, alongside Amharic and Guizi, the liturgical language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. This broad education equipped him with the intellectual foundation necessary for navigating both domestic affairs and Ethiopia's interactions with the outside world. Tafari demonstrated exceptional intelligence and maturity, earning him the respect of elders and scholars alike. As a young man, Tafari displayed a keen interest in Ethiopian politics, closely observing the leadership style of his father and other influential figures in the empire. Ras Makonnen's frequent travels as a diplomat allowed Tafari to interact with diverse cultures and understand the complexities of global politics. These experiences deeply influenced Tafari's vision for Ethiopia, planting the seeds of his ambition to modernize and strengthen the nation. Despite his young age, Tafari showed a remarkable ability to handle responsibilities, leading to his appointment as governor of Garamulata at just 13 years old. His role as a governor was both a test of his capabilities and a reflection of his growing influence. Tafari's governance was marked by his fair treatment of the local population and his efforts to improve administrative efficiency. His success in this role further solidified his reputation as a capable leader. However, Tafari's ambitions were not limited to regional governance. He harbored a vision of a united and modern Ethiopia, and his actions consistently reflected this desire. A defining moment in Tafari's early life was his close association with Emperor Menelik II. Menelik recognized Tafari's potential and treated him as a trusted confidant, granting him opportunities to participate in important political discussions. This mentorship laid the groundwork for Tafari's future rise to power. Following Menelik's death, Ethiopia entered a period of uncertainty, but Tafari's political acumen allowed him to navigate these turbulent times effectively. His ability to balance tradition with progressive ideas made him a unique figure within the Ethiopian elite. Tafari's early years were also marked by his devout faith and adherence to Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. His spiritual commitment not only shaped his personal values, but also became a central aspect of his leadership style. He believed that his role as a leader was divinely ordained, a conviction that would later become a cornerstone of his reign as emperor. These formative years instilled in Tafari a deep sense of responsibility and purpose, setting the stage for his ascent to the pinnacle of Ethiopian politics. By the time Tafari entered his 20s, he had already established himself as a capable and forward-thinking leader. His unique blend of intellectual rigor, political savvy, and spiritual devotion distinguished him from his peers, making him a rising star in the Ethiopian Empire. The experiences and lessons of his youth not only prepared him for the challenges ahead, but also defined the man who would later be crowned Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah. This phase of Tafari Makonnen's life serves as a critical foundation for understanding his journey and the legacy he left behind. From the remote highlands of Addis Ababa to the halls of Ethiopian power, The early years of Haile Selassie reveal a story of promise, ambition, and preparation for a destiny that would change Ethiopia forever. Part 2. Rise to Power. Haile Selassie's rise to power began with a combination of calculated political moves, diplomatic prowess, and his ability to align himself with Ethiopia's shifting power dynamics. Following the death of Emperor Menelik II in 1913, Ethiopia faced a period of political uncertainty. Lige Iyasu, Menelik's designated successor, took the throne, but his reign quickly became controversial. Iyasu's policies alienated Ethiopia's nobility, particularly his perceived leniency toward Islam in a predominantly Christian nation. This unrest provided Tafari Makonnen an opportunity to position himself as a stabilizing force. By 1916, Tafari played a central role in a coup that deposed Iyasu, citing his lack of loyalty to Ethiopian traditions and the Orthodox Church. The coup was largely supported by Ethiopia's influential clergy and nobility, who saw Tafari as a more suitable leader. After Iyasu's removal, Empress Zuditu, Menelik II's daughter, was crowned as the monarch. Tafari, at just 24 years old, was appointed regent and heir apparent, a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of his ascendancy to ultimate power. As regent, Tafari Makonnen quickly became the de facto ruler of Ethiopia, overshadowing the ceremonial role of Empress Zuditu. He distinguished himself with his focus on modernization and foreign diplomacy, two areas that had been neglected in previous reigns. Tafari established Ethiopia's first printing press, modernized the army, and introduced infrastructure projects such as roads and bridges. These reforms not only strengthened Ethiopia's internal stability, but also elevated its status on the international stage. Tafari's progressive vision for Ethiopia extended beyond domestic policies. He recognized the importance of engaging with foreign powers to ensure Ethiopia's sovereignty in a time when European colonization was rapidly spreading across Africa. In 1923, under Tafari's leadership, Ethiopia became a member of the League of Nations, marking a significant achievement in asserting the nation's independence. Tafari's diplomacy was instrumental in showcasing Ethiopia as a sovereign and modernizing state, earning him recognition as a forward-thinking leader. While Tafari's reforms garnered international acclaim, they also created tensions within Ethiopia. Many members of the traditional elite resisted his policies, fearing the erosion of their privileges and the influence of foreign ideas. Empress Zuditu herself was often at odds with Tafari, preferring to uphold conservative traditions rather than embrace his modernizing agenda. This power struggle between the empress and her regent was a defining feature of Tafari's early leadership, yet he managed to navigate these challenges with remarkable skill. Tafari's political acumen was further demonstrated during his diplomatic tours abroad. In 1924, he embarked on a historic trip to Europe and the Middle East, visiting countries such as France, Italy, and the United Kingdom. This journey not only solidified Ethiopia's ties with major powers, but also exposed Tafari to modern governance practices and technological advancements. He returned to Ethiopia more determined than ever to implement his vision of a modern, unified nation. The death of Empress Zuditu in 1930 removed the final obstacle to Tafari's ascent to the throne. Historians note that her death occurred under suspicious circumstances, fueling speculation about political intrigue, though no conclusive evidence has ever been found. Following her passing, Tafari was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie on November 2, 1930, in a grand ceremony that symbolized the dawn of a new era for Ethiopia. His coronation was attended by foreign dignitaries, further emphasizing Ethiopia's growing prominence on the world stage. With his ascension to emperor, Haile Selassie adopted the titles King of Kings, Elect of God, and Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah. These titles reinforced his divine right to rule and his connection to Ethiopia's ancient Solomonic dynasty. Haile Selassie's rise to power marked a turning point in Ethiopian history, as he sought to balance the preservation of traditional values with the demands of modernization and global diplomacy. By the time he became emperor, Haile Selassie had already established himself as a visionary leader with a profound understanding of both domestic and international politics. His ability to navigate Ethiopia's complex political landscape, secure alliances, and implement reforms laid the foundation for his long and transformative reign. The story of his rise is a testament to his resilience, intellect, and unwavering commitment to his nation. The rise of Haile Selassie not only reshaped Ethiopia's trajectory, but also cemented his status as a key figure in African and global history. From regent to emperor, his journey to power reflects a leader determined to carve out a modern identity for his nation while safeguarding its independence in an increasingly interconnected world. Part 3. Modernizing Ethiopia. Haile Selassie's early years as emperor were defined by his commitment to modernizing Ethiopia and securing its place as a sovereign nation in an increasingly interconnected world. Recognizing the need for reform, Selassie introduced sweeping changes to Ethiopia's military, educational systems, and infrastructure. These efforts were driven by his vision of a strong and unified Ethiopia capable of resisting external threats and internal division. One of his first significant reforms was the modernization of the Ethiopian military. Traditionally reliant on regional militias and outdated tactics, Ethiopia's defense forces were reorganized into a centralized structure. Haile Selassie sought foreign expertise, bringing in military advisors from nations such as Sweden and Belgium to train Ethiopian soldiers. Modern weaponry and strategies were introduced, signaling a shift toward a more formidable national defense. This effort was crucial in a time when imperial ambitions by European powers posed a constant threat. Education was another cornerstone of Selassie's modernization agenda. He believed that an educated population was essential for the nation's progress. Under his leadership, Ethiopia's first modern schools were established, including the Tafari Makonnen School in Addis Ababa. These institutions emphasized science, mathematics, and other secular subjects, alongside traditional religious education. Scholarships were also introduced, enabling Ethiopian students to study abroad and bring back knowledge and skills that would contribute to the country's development. Haile Selassie's focus on education extended to the empowerment of women, a groundbreaking initiative in Ethiopia at the time. Girls were encouraged to attend schools, and the curriculum was gradually expanded to include vocational training and advanced studies. While these reforms faced resistance from conservative elements within Ethiopian society, Selassie's persistence ensured their gradual implementation. Infrastructure development was another critical area of focus. Ethiopia's transportation network, which was limited to rudimentary roads and trails, underwent significant expansion under Selassie's reign. Modern highways and bridges were constructed to connect remote regions with urban centers, facilitating trade and communication. The introduction of Ethiopia's first railway linking Addis Ababa to Djibouti further boosted the country's economy and opened new opportunities for international commerce. Electricity and telecommunications were also introduced, particularly in urban areas, symbolizing Ethiopia's entry into the modern era. In addition to domestic reforms, Selassie sought to enhance Ethiopia's standing in the global community. His efforts to secure Ethiopia's membership in the League of Nations in 1923 were a landmark achievement. This membership affirmed Ethiopia's sovereignty and elevated its status as an independent African nation in a world dominated by colonial powers. Selassie's diplomatic initiatives also included forging alliances with nations such as Japan and the United States, which supported his vision for a modern and resilient Ethiopia. Despite his numerous achievements, Selassie's modernization efforts were not without challenges. Many members of the traditional nobility resisted these changes, viewing them as a threat to their authority and privileges. Landowners, in particular, were wary of reforms that aimed to centralize power and reduce regional autonomy. This resistance often slowed the pace of progress, forcing Selassie to navigate a delicate balance between innovation and tradition. Additionally, the disparity between urban and rural areas became increasingly evident during Selassie's reign. While cities like Addis Ababa benefited significantly from modernization, rural Ethiopia often lagged behind. The emperor's focus on centralization meant that resources were concentrated in urban centers, leaving many rural communities underserved. These disparities sowed the seeds of future discontent and highlighted the complexities of implementing widespread reform in a diverse and traditional society. Haile Selassie's commitment to modernization was a defining feature of his early reign. His reforms not only laid the groundwork for Ethiopia's transformation, but also inspired other African nations seeking to assert their independence and modernize their societies. However, the challenges he faced also underscored the difficulties of balancing progress with tradition in a rapidly changing world. By the 1930s, Ethiopia had begun to emerge as a more cohesive and modern state under Selassie's leadership. Yet the looming threat of external aggression, particularly from fascist Italy, would soon test the strength of these reforms and the resilience of the Ethiopian people. The achievements of this period set the stage for one of the most challenging chapters in Haile Selassie's life and reign. Part 4. The Italian Threat. By the mid-1930s, Ethiopia's position as one of the few independent nations in Africa made it a target for imperialist ambitions, particularly from Mussolini's fascist Italy. As the world's colonial powers expanded their control over African territories, Italy sought to expand its influence and resources by conquering Ethiopia. Haile Selassie's modernization efforts had made Ethiopia more formidable, but the nation remained ill-prepared for the full-scale military might of a European power. Mussolini's regime viewed Ethiopia as an obstacle to Italy's ambitions in East Africa. The Italian government under Mussolini's leadership had begun to aggressively pursue expansionist policies, seeing Ethiopia as the final piece in their vision for an East African empire. Mussolini had long coveted Ethiopia for its fertile lands, strategic location, and historical significance, particularly in his desire to revive the ancient Roman Empire's prestige. For him, an invasion of Ethiopia was not just about territorial expansion, but also about asserting Italy's dominance on the world stage. Haile Selassie recognized the threat long before the Italian invasion began, and in the early 1930s, he worked tirelessly to prepare Ethiopia for war. Knowing that Ethiopia's military was relatively weak compared to European powers, Selassie sought to bolster its defenses through modernization and sought alliances with other nations to secure support. However, the League of Nations, which Ethiopia had joined in 1923, proved ineffective in addressing the growing threat from Italy. Selassie appealed to the League for help, warning of the consequences of Italy's aggression, but the international community failed to act decisively. The Ethiopian emperor's efforts to build alliances outside of Africa also proved insufficient. While he established diplomatic ties with countries like France, Great Britain, and United States, these powers were preoccupied with their own issues and had little interest in intervening in Ethiopia's defense. Selassie's attempts to obtain modern military equipment from these nations were often stymied by political and logistical barriers. At the same time, the rise of fascist and authoritarian governments across Europe made it more difficult for Ethiopia to gain meaningful support. In October 1935, Mussolini launched his full-scale invasion of Ethiopia, sending an army that was well-equipped with modern weapons, including tanks, airplanes, and chemical warfare agents. The Ethiopian military, despite its efforts to modernize, was still composed largely of infantry, with outdated equipment and limited training. This imbalance in military capability was immediately apparent as the Italian forces advanced into Ethiopia, swiftly capturing several key cities and towns. Haile Selassie's response to the invasion was one of unwavering defiance. He mobilized Ethiopia's soldiers and citizens to resist the Italian forces, showing the world that his nation would not surrender easily. Despite being vastly outnumbered and outgunned, the Ethiopian army fought valiantly, with soldiers often relying on traditional weapons, such as spears and machetes, to combat modern artillery and machine guns. The Ethiopian resistance, though brave, struggled to halt the Italian advance. Selassie's commitment to the defense of Ethiopia became a rallying cry for the Ethiopian people, and he personally led efforts to coordinate the defense of Addis Ababa and other strategic locations. However, the brutality of Italian forces soon became evident, as Mussolini's army employed chemical weapons, including mustard gas, against Ethiopian soldiers and civilians. These tactics, though devastating, only served to deepen the resolve of the Ethiopian people to resist the foreign invaders. As the war progressed, it became clear that Ethiopia was outmatched by Italy's technological superiority. Despite their best efforts, the Ethiopian forces could not prevent the fall of key cities. By May 1936, Addis Ababa itself was captured by the Italian army, and Haile Selassie was forced to make a heart-wrenching decision. His duty to his people and his nation required him to flee Ethiopia and seek support on the global stage in the hopes of rallying international resistance against Italian imperialism. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia marked the beginning of a dark chapter in the country's history, but Haile Selassie's resolve remained unbroken. His exile would set the stage for his international campaign to regain Ethiopia's sovereignty and continue the fight against fascism. Selassie's leadership during this critical period would forever solidify his place as a symbol of resistance against colonialism and oppression. Part 5. Exile and Global Advocacy. After the fall of Addis Ababa in 1936, Haile Selassie was forced into exile, leaving behind a devastated Ethiopia under Italian occupation. His journey out of Ethiopia was fraught with danger, as he sought refuge in neighboring countries before finally arriving in Jerusalem and eventually making his way to Europe. Selassie's exile was not only a personal loss, but a blow to Ethiopia's sovereignty and independence, with his absence leaving a power vacuum that the Italian occupiers exploited to consolidate control. However, Haile Selassie's exile did not mean the end of his struggle for Ethiopia's freedom. Recognizing the need for international support to counter Italy's aggression, Selassie began a diplomatic campaign across Europe and the world, seeking to draw attention to the unjust invasion of his country. He took every opportunity to raise awareness of Ethiopia's plight, and through his speeches and diplomatic efforts, he garnered sympathy and support from the international community, particularly from anti-fascist groups. One of his most significant appearances during his exile was at the League of Nations in 1936, where Haile Selassie delivered a powerful and memorable speech condemning Italy's invasion. In his address, Selassie spoke eloquently about the principles of sovereignty, justice, and international solidarity, calling on the League to take action against Italy for its blatant act of aggression. His speech is widely regarded as one of the most stirring moments in the history of international diplomacy, as Selassie decried the failure of the League of Nations to protect Ethiopia and prevent the spread of fascism. In his speech, Haile Selassie famously stated, "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." This prophetic warning highlighted the broader threat posed by fascist expansionism and the danger of appeasement towards aggressive powers like Italy. His words resonated with many who recognized the global implications of the conflict, and for the first time, Ethiopia's struggle was framed within the context of a larger battle between tyranny and freedom. Selassie's diplomatic efforts were not confined to Europe alone. He sought support from other African leaders and leaders of the global anti-colonial movement, urging them to rally behind Ethiopia's cause. At the time, the Italian occupation was a symbol of the broader fight for African independence, and many saw Selassie's resistance as emblematic of the struggle for liberation across the continent. His calls for African unity and solidarity found a receptive audience, particularly in countries that were themselves under colonial rule. Selassie's personal dignity and his resolute stance in the face of adversity elevated him to a symbol of resistance against colonialism, and his leadership became a source of inspiration for African nationalists and the global anti-imperialist movement. His efforts were not only political but also humanitarian, as he sought international aid for Ethiopian refugees and made it clear that his goal was not just to regain his throne, but to restore Ethiopia's independence and sovereignty. In 1937, the Italian regime issued a formal proclamation declaring that the conquest of Ethiopia was complete and that it was now an Italian colony. Despite this, Haile Selassie remained steadfast in his advocacy, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of Italian rule over his homeland. His exile continued, but his efforts to keep the international spotlight on Ethiopia's plight helped prevent Italy from gaining full international recognition of its occupation. Throughout the years of his exile, Haile Selassie maintained the belief that Ethiopia's sovereignty would eventually be restored, and he worked relentlessly to ensure that the world would remember Ethiopia's suffering under Italian rule. His ability to maintain a sense of hope and leadership during this dark time was remarkable, and he cultivated support from governments, organizations, and individuals who shared his vision for an independent Ethiopia. While the challenges of exile were immense, Haile Selassie's international advocacy efforts brought the issue of Ethiopia to the forefront of global discourse. His leadership during these years solidified his place not just as the Emperor of Ethiopia, but as a champion of global justice and anti-colonial resistance. As the world began to shift towards a Second World War, the stage was set for the eventual restoration of Ethiopia's sovereignty. Though the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, Haile Selassie's unwavering commitment to his people and his country ensured that Ethiopia's struggle would never be forgotten. His exile, far from weakening his resolve, made him one of the most prominent figures in the fight against fascism and colonialism, and the world began to recognize the significance of Ethiopia's independence struggle in the broader context of global liberation. Part 6. The Path to Liberation. The struggle for Ethiopia's liberation was not one that Haile Selassie could wage alone, and the global political landscape of the late 1930s and early 1940s would become crucial to his efforts. As World War II escalated, the shifting alliances and priorities of the major powers began to play in Ethiopia's favor. Selassie's diplomatic efforts to keep the issue of Ethiopia's occupation alive on the world stage, combined with the growing resistance to fascism, set the stage for the eventual liberation of his country. In the late 1930s, Italy's occupation of Ethiopia was an affront to the growing anti-fascist movement sweeping across Europe and the world. The Italian invasion, coupled with the brutal occupation tactics, especially the use of chemical warfare against civilians, brought widespread international condemnation. The League of Nations had failed to prevent the invasion, but as the Second World War erupted, the major European powers found themselves increasingly preoccupied with defeating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, leaving Italy to fend for itself in Africa. In this period of global upheaval, Selassie found new opportunities to build alliances. One of the key developments was the alliance between Britain and Ethiopia during World War II. As Italy became embroiled in its own conflict with the Allied forces, the British recognized that it was in their strategic interest to remove Mussolini's control over Ethiopia. The British began to offer more tangible support to Haile Selassie's cause, viewing him not just as the legitimate ruler of Ethiopia, but also as a leader who could help defeat fascism in Africa. By 1940, Ethiopia's resistance movement began to gain strength, with Ethiopian guerrilla fighters known as the Arbanyak Patriots waging attacks against Italian forces in the countryside. These fighters were crucial to weakening the Italian occupation from within, and their knowledge of the terrain allowed them to launch effective hit-and-run operations against the occupying forces. Their efforts, combined with the Allied bombing campaigns against Italian positions, severely disrupted Italy's hold on Ethiopia. Haile Selassie's diplomatic influence continued to grow as he garnered the support of global powers such as Britain and the United States. He strategically used his position as a leader of an occupied country to galvanize international support, emphasizing the broader implications of Italy's colonial aggression. His role as a figurehead for African independence and anti-colonialism resonated deeply with many African leaders and activists who viewed his fight as part of the larger battle against European imperialism. In 1941, as the tide of war turned against Mussolini's fascist regime, British forces, with Ethiopian support, launched a military campaign to liberate Ethiopia. The British East Africa Command, in coordination with the Ethiopian resistance, succeeded in defeating the Italian forces and recapturing Addis Ababa. The success of the campaign marked a turning point in Ethiopia's liberation, and Haile Selassie was able to return to his homeland in triumph in May 1941. Upon his return, Haile Selassie was greeted as a liberator, hailed by his people as the rightful emperor who had restored Ethiopia's independence. The Italian occupation had lasted 5 years, but in those years, Ethiopia's resilience had been tested, and Haile Selassie's leadership had proven to be an indomitable force against the forces of fascism and colonialism. The path to Ethiopia's liberation was fraught with hardship, but Haile Selassie's efforts, combined with the resilience of the Ethiopian people and the changing dynamics of World War II, ensured that Ethiopia would reclaim its sovereignty. His return to Addis Ababa was not only a personal victory for the emperor, but also a significant moment in the history of African liberation, as it demonstrated the power of resistance against colonial powers. Haile Selassie's liberation marked the end of a dark chapter in Ethiopia's history and the restoration of a nation's independence. However, the challenges facing Ethiopia were far from over. The task of rebuilding the country Re-establishing its institutions and navigating the post-war geopolitical landscape would require continued leadership and vision. This victory was only the beginning of a new era in Ethiopia's history, and Haile Selassie's role in shaping its future would remain pivotal for years to come. Part 7. Rebuilding a Nation. With Ethiopia's liberation in 1941, Haile Selassie faced the monumental task of rebuilding a nation shattered by 5 years of brutal Italian occupation. The physical devastation was extensive, with roads, bridges, and cities heavily damaged, while institutions such as schools, hospitals, and government offices were left in disarray. Beyond the physical destruction, the psychological toll on the Ethiopian people demanded healing and unity, as communities sought to recover from years of warfare and occupation. Haile Selassie's first priority was to re-establish Ethiopia's sovereignty and authority over its territory. During the Italian occupation, the Ethiopian administrative system had been dismantled, and the emperor's immediate focus was on reinstating central control. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the government, reappointing loyal officials to key positions and establishing new ministries to oversee vital areas such as education, health, and defense. Selassie's leadership during this period was critical in ensuring that Ethiopia regained its political and administrative stability. Rebuilding Ethiopia's military was also a key focus. The Italian invasion had exposed the inadequacies of Ethiopia's pre-war military, and Selassie was determined to create a modern and professional defense force. With support from allied nations, he introduced new training programs, updated military equipment, and reorganized the structure of the armed forces. The aim was not only to protect Ethiopia's borders, but also to ensure that the country would never again fall victim to foreign aggression. Education was another cornerstone of Haile Selassie's post-war rebuilding efforts. The emperor recognized that education was critical to Ethiopia's progress and resilience. He reopened schools that had been closed during the occupation and established new institutions to provide broader access to education. Scholarships were introduced to allow Ethiopian students to study abroad, particularly in allied countries, and bring back knowledge and expertise. Selassie also emphasized the importance of educating women, continuing his pre-war efforts to promote gender equality in education. Haile Selassie's vision for Ethiopia's future extended to the modernization of infrastructure. Roads, railways, and communication networks were repaired and expanded to facilitate economic recovery and improve connectivity between urban and rural areas. The emperor also prioritized the development of healthcare systems, establishing new hospitals and clinics to address the widespread health challenges faced by the population in the aftermath of war. These efforts aimed to create a foundation for a healthier, more productive society. Beyond domestic rebuilding, Selassie worked to restore Ethiopia's international standing. He reasserted Ethiopia's membership in global organizations, including the newly formed United Nations, where he played an active role in advocating for African independence and anti-colonialism. Selassie's diplomatic efforts ensured that Ethiopia was recognized as a sovereign and independent nation, while also positioning the country as a leader in the emerging Pan-Africa movement. Rebuilding Ethiopia was not without its challenges. The Italian occupation had left deep scars on Ethiopian society, and tensions between those who had resisted the Italians and those accused of collaborating created divisions. Selassie sought to address these tensions by promoting reconciliation and unity, encouraging Ethiopians to focus on the shared goal of rebuilding their country. However, resentment and mistrust lingered in some communities, highlighting the complexity of post-occupation recovery. Economic recovery was another major challenge. The war had disrupted agriculture, Ethiopia's primary economic sector, leading to food shortages and economic instability. Haile Selassie implemented agricultural reforms to boost production, including the distribution of seeds and tools to farmers. These measures, though helpful, were slow to address the deeper structural issues in Ethiopia's agrarian economy. Despite the difficulties, Haile Selassie's efforts to rebuild Ethiopia laid the groundwork for the country's future. His leadership during this critical period demonstrated his commitment to his people and his vision of a strong, independent, and modern Ethiopia. While the scars of war and occupation would take time to heal, Selassie's resilience and determination provided a sense of hope and direction for the nation. The post-liberation years marked the beginning of a new chapter in Ethiopia's history. Haile Selassie's focus on modernization, unity, and international engagement set the stage for Ethiopia's transformation, even as the challenges of development and governance continued to shape the country's journey. Part 8. Ethiopia and the United Nations. Following Ethiopia's liberation, Haile Selassie recognized the importance of securing his nation's position on the global stage. The formation of the United Nations in 1945 offered an opportunity for Ethiopia to assert itself as a sovereign state and a voice for smaller, historically colonized nations. Selassie's leadership in Ethiopia's international engagement became a cornerstone of his post-liberation strategy, as he sought to ensure his nation's future security and development through diplomatic alliances. Ethiopia was one of the original 51 founding members of the United Nations, and Haile Selassie played a critical role in shaping its early contributions to the organization. His presence symbolized the resilience of a nation that had endured colonization but had reclaimed its independence, and he used Ethiopia's membership to advocate for the principles of sovereignty, non-aggression, and mutual respect among nations. Selassie saw the United Nations as a platform to champion not only Ethiopia's interests, but also the broader cause of decolonization and human rights. Haile Selassie's advocacy at the United Nations was deeply informed by Ethiopia's experience with the League of Nations, whose failure to act decisively against Italy's invasion had highlighted the weaknesses of international governance. Selassie argued that the UN must not repeat the mistakes of its predecessor and emphasized the need for collective security and enforcement of international law. His speeches at the General Assembly were impassioned calls for justice, particularly for smaller nations that lack the military and economic power to defend themselves. Ethiopia's role in the United Nations extended beyond advocacy for its own sovereignty. Haile Selassie positioned his country as a supporter of African independence movements, using the platform to amplify the voices of colonized nations. This stance resonated with newly independent African states, as well as those still fighting for liberation, and Ethiopia became a symbol of resistance to colonial domination. Selassie's leadership helped solidify Ethiopia's reputation as a leading voice in the Pan-Africa movement. Ethiopia also contributed to international peacekeeping efforts under the United Nations. Selassie's belief in collective security translated into a willingness to commit Ethiopian troops to UN missions, marking the country as a contributor to global stability. One of the most notable instances was Ethiopia's participation in the Korean War as part of the UN coalition, where Ethiopian soldiers, known as the Kagnu Battalion, earned a reputation for bravery and professionalism. This contribution bolstered Ethiopia's standing within the United Nations and demonstrated its commitment to international peace. At the same time, Selassie worked to ensure that Ethiopia benefited economically and politically from its UN membership. He sought technical and financial assistance through UN development programs, focusing on areas such as agriculture, education, and infrastructure. These programs helped Ethiopia rebuild and modernize, even as it faced the ongoing challenges of poverty and underdevelopment. Selassie also lobbied for Ethiopia's inclusion in global trade and economic agreements, aiming to position the country as a viable player in international markets. Haile Selassie's commitment to the United Nations was not without its challenges. The geopolitical realities of the Cold War often overshadowed the concerns of smaller nations like Ethiopia, as superpower rivalries dominated the agenda. Despite this, Selassie remained steadfast in his belief that the UN was a vital institution for promoting peace and justice. His persistence ensured that Ethiopia's voice was heard, even in a world where the interests of major powers often took precedence. Selassie's engagement with the United Nations also reflected his broader vision of Ethiopia as a bridge between Africa and the world. By actively participating in the UN, he sought to demonstrate that Ethiopia was not an isolated nation, but a part of the global community. This approach helped to foster a sense of pride among Ethiopians, as their country emerged as a leader in the fight for equality and justice on the international stage. Under Haile Selassie's guidance, Ethiopia's role in the United Nations became a source of inspiration for other African nations. His leadership exemplified the potential of international collaboration and advocacy to address the challenges faced by smaller and historically marginalized nations. As the decolonization movement gained momentum in the mid-20th century, Ethiopia's example served as a reminder of the importance of resilience, diplomacy, and unity in the face of adversity. Through his efforts at the United Nations, Haile Selassie not only strengthened Ethiopia's global standing, but also advanced the broader cause of African sovereignty and self-determination. His vision and leadership during this period laid the groundwork for Ethiopia's continued engagement with international institutions and its role as a champion of justice and independence in the global arena. Part 9. The Rise of Pan-Africanism. As Ethiopia regained its footing after liberation, Haile Selassie turned his attention to a larger vision, the unification and liberation of Africa. Having witnessed the devastating effects of colonialism and fascist aggression, Selassie believed that a united Africa could counter external domination and promote peace, stability, and progress on the continent. His leadership in the Pan-African movement elevated Ethiopia's role as a symbol of resilience and independence. In the 1950s and 1960s, the wave of decolonization swept across Africa, with numerous countries gaining independence from European powers. During this period of transformation, Haile Selassie emerged as a prominent advocate for African unity, calling on the newly independent nations to work together to achieve collective goals. He emphasized the importance of solidarity, arguing that only a united Africa could protect its sovereignty and ensure its development. One of Selassie's most significant contributions to Pan-Africanism was the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963. Recognizing the need for a formal platform to address African issues, he invited leaders from across the continent to Addis Ababa to discuss the formation of a united body. The conference was a historic event, bringing together representatives from 32 African states to deliberate on the challenges and opportunities facing the continent. At the inaugural meeting of the OAU, Haile Selassie delivered a powerful speech emphasizing the need for unity. He stated, "We must act while we can, while we have the strength, while the balance of forces favors us. To delay any longer would be to betray our future." His words underscored the urgency of collective action, and his leadership played a pivotal role in securing the consensus needed to establish the organization. The OAU was founded on principles that reflected Selassie's vision: respect for the sovereignty of member states, non-interference in internal affairs, and the promotion of African development. The organization also sought to resolve conflicts between member states through dialogue and diplomacy, reflecting Selassie's belief in peaceful solutions to disputes. Addis Ababa became the headquarters of the OAU, symbolizing Ethiopia's central role in the Pan-African movement. Under Selassie's guidance, the OAU championed the causes of liberation and anti-colonialism. The organization provided support to freedom movements in countries still under colonial or apartheid rule, such as South Africa, Angola, and Mozambique. Selassie used his influence to rally African leaders around these causes, emphasizing the moral and political imperative of helping oppressed peoples achieve self-determination. Beyond political unification, Selassie also advocated for economic and cultural collaboration among African nations. He encouraged trade agreements, the sharing of technical expertise, and initiatives to preserve and celebrate Africa's rich cultural heritage. He envisioned an Africa that was self-reliant, with nations working together to build a future free from the economic and political domination of foreign powers. However, the road to African unity was not without challenges. Differences in political ideologies, economic priorities, and historical experiences often created divisions among member states. Selassie worked tirelessly to mediate these differences, using his reputation as a seasoned leader and statesman to bring parties together. While disagreements persisted, the establishment of the OAU was a landmark achievement, providing a platform for dialogue and cooperation. Haile Selassie's leadership in the Pan-African movement earned him admiration from leaders and activists across the continent. Figures such as Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya saw him as a symbol of African resilience and unity. His role in fostering collaboration between African nations solidified his legacy as a key architect of the continent's post-colonial transformation. Through his efforts, Haile Selassie demonstrated that Ethiopia's struggle for independence was not an isolated victory, but part of a broader movement for African liberation. His vision of unity, self-reliance, and cooperation remains a cornerstone of Pan-African thought. The creation of the OAU was a testament to his belief in the potential of a united Africa, and its legacy continues to shape the continent's journey toward integration and development. Haile Selassie's commitment to Pan-Africanism highlighted his understanding of Africa's interconnectedness and the shared destiny of its peoples. His leadership during this pivotal era reinforced Ethiopia's position as a beacon of independence and a leader in the fight for justice and equality. The rise of Pan-Africanism under Selassie's guidance marked a new chapter in Africa's history, laying the foundation for continued efforts toward unity and progress. Part 10. Modernizing Ethiopia. As a visionary leader, Haile Selassie recognized that Ethiopia's survival and progress depended on modernization. Following the liberation and re-establishment of the country's sovereignty, he embarked on an ambitious program to transform Ethiopia into a modern state. Selassie's modernization efforts encompassed multiple areas, including education, infrastructure, governance, and the economy, reflecting his belief that progress was essential for national resilience and development. One of Selassie's most significant contributions to modernization was his focus on education. He understood that an educated populace was critical to Ethiopia's advancement. In the years following liberation, he established numerous schools and institutions of higher learning, including Addis Ababa University. Selassie also promoted the development of technical and vocational training programs to equip Ethiopians with the skills needed to participate in the modern economy. To broaden access to education, scholarships were offered to promising students, allowing them to study abroad and bring back valuable expertise. The emperor's vision for modernization extended to the development of infrastructure. Recognizing the importance of connectivity for economic growth and governance, he prioritized the construction of roads, bridges, and railways to link Ethiopia's diverse regions. He also invested in modern communication systems, such as telephone networks and postal services, to improve communication across the country. These projects not only enhanced Ethiopia's economic prospects, but also fostered a sense of national unity by reducing the isolation of rural areas. Haile Selassie also worked to modernize Ethiopia's economy, which was primarily agrarian and underdeveloped. He implemented land reform policies to increase agricultural productivity and introduced measures to promote industrialization. Factories, mills, and processing plants were established to diversify the economy and reduce dependence on imports. Selassie encouraged foreign investment and partnerships, bringing in expertise and resources to support Ethiopia's industrial growth. Despite these efforts, economic inequality and resistance from traditional elites often hindered the full implementation of his reforms. In governance, Selassie sought to modernize Ethiopia's legal and administrative systems. He introduced a new constitution in 1955, which aimed to balance the powers of the monarchy with those of elected bodies. The Constitution provided for a bicameral parliament and outlined the rights of citizens, reflecting Selassie's vision of gradual democratization. While the reforms marked a step forward, they were criticized for maintaining the emperor's central authority and limiting genuine political participation. Selassie's modernization efforts also extended to healthcare. Recognizing the importance of public health for national development, he established hospitals, clinics, and medical training institutions. Campaigns to combat diseases such as malaria and smallpox were launched, with support from international organizations. These initiatives improved access to healthcare and addressed some of the pressing health challenges faced by Ethiopia's population. Cultural modernization was another aspect of Selassie's vision. He encouraged the blending of Ethiopia's rich traditions with modern influences, promoting music, literature, and art that reflected the country's evolving identity. This cultural renaissance helped to strengthen national pride while showcasing Ethiopia's unique heritage on the global stage. Despite his ambitious efforts, modernization in Ethiopia faced significant challenges. Resistance from traditional elites, limited financial resources, and a rapidly growing population created obstacles to progress. Additionally, the benefits of modernization were often unevenly distributed, with urban areas, and the elite reaping more advantages than rural communities and the poor. Selassie's centralized approach to governance also drew criticism, as it sometimes stifled local initiatives and innovation. Nevertheless, Haile Selassie's modernization programs laid the foundation for Ethiopia's transformation. His emphasis on education, infrastructure, and economic diversification reflected a forward-thinking approach to leadership. While not without flaws, his efforts demonstrated a commitment to improving the lives of his people and positioning Ethiopia as a modern and independent nation. Modernization under Selassie's rule was a complex and evolving process, shaped by both his vision and the challenges of the time. His leadership during this period showcased his dedication to progress and his belief in Ethiopia's potential to thrive in a changing world. The legacy of his modernization efforts continues to influence Ethiopia's development, underscoring the enduring impact of his reign. Part 11. Ethiopia's role in the Cold War. As the global political landscape shifted during the Cold War, Haile Selassie strategically positioned Ethiopia as a key player in the ideological and geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ethiopia's unique location in the Horn of Africa, combined with its historical sovereignty and leadership in the Pan-Africa movement, made it a significant ally for Western powers. Selassie skillfully navigated this turbulent era, leveraging Ethiopia's strategic importance to secure support for his country's development and security. During the early years of the Cold War, Ethiopia aligned itself with the United States and other Western nations. Selassie's decision was driven by practical considerations, including the need for military assistance and economic aid. In 1953, Ethiopia signed a mutual defense assistance agreement with the United States, solidifying its role as a key American ally in Africa. This partnership provided Ethiopia with advanced weaponry, military training, and financial support, which Selassie used to modernize the Ethiopian armed forces and strengthen national defense. Ethiopia's alliance with the West also extended to broader political and economic cooperation. Selassie cultivated strong ties with American leaders, emphasizing Ethiopia's commitment to democracy and independence. In return, Ethiopia received significant economic aid, which was used to fund infrastructure projects, education programs, and healthcare initiatives. Selassie's ability to maintain Ethiopia's independence while benefiting from Western support highlighted his diplomatic acumen and strategic vision. The geopolitical importance of Ethiopia became even more apparent as Cold War tensions intensified in the 1960s and 1970s. The United States viewed Ethiopia as a bulwark against Soviet influence in Africa, particularly given its proximity to the Middle East and key shipping lanes in the Red Sea. In response, the U.S. expanded its military and economic assistance to Ethiopia, reinforcing the country's position as a cornerstone of its African strategy. Selassie used this support to further Ethiopia's modernization efforts and bolster its international standing. Despite Ethiopia's alignment with the West, Haile Selassie maintained a policy of non-alignment within the broader context of the Cold War. He actively participated in the non-aligned movement, which sought to provide an alternative to the binary divisions of the Cold War. Selassie's engagement in this movement demonstrated his commitment to Ethiopian sovereignty and his desire to avoid becoming overly dependent on any single power bloc. This approach allowed Ethiopia to maintain diplomatic relationships with both Eastern and Western nations, ensuring flexibility in its foreign policy. Ethiopia's involvement in the Cold War also had implications for its role in Africa. Selassie used his influence to advocate for peace and stability on the continent, often acting as a mediator in conflicts involving African states. He emphasized the importance of African unity and worked to prevent the Cold War's ideological divisions from undermining the solidarity of the Pan-Africa movement. Selassie's efforts in this regard underscored his vision of Ethiopia as a leader in promoting peace and cooperation. However, Ethiopia's strategic importance during the Cold War was not without challenges. The country's reliance on Western support created tensions among segments of Ethiopian society, particularly those who viewed the partnership as a compromise of national sovereignty. Additionally, the influx of foreign aid often benefited the elite more than the general population, contributing to growing discontent and inequality. Selassie's centralized governance style further exacerbated these tensions, as critics accused him of prioritizing foreign alliances over domestic needs. As the Cold War progressed, Ethiopia faced increasing internal challenges, including political dissent and economic hardship. The reliance on foreign aid became a double-edged sword, as it fostered dependency while failing to address the structural issues within the Ethiopian economy. These challenges foreshadowed the growing unrest that would eventually culminate in significant political upheaval. Haile Selassie's engagement in the Cold War reflected his pragmatic approach to leadership. By aligning Ethiopia with the West while maintaining a degree of non-alignment, he secured valuable resources and support for his country. However, the complexities of this era highlighted the delicate balance between national sovereignty and international alliances. Through his Cold War diplomacy, Selassie demonstrated Ethiopia's ability to navigate a rapidly changing world while preserving its independence. His leadership during this period underscored the importance of strategic alliances and adaptability in ensuring the nation's survival and progress. Ethiopia's role in the Cold War remains a testament to Selassie's vision and enduring legacy of his diplomatic efforts. Part 12. The Challenges of Governance and Dissent. As Haile Selassie's reign progressed, Ethiopia's internal political landscape grew increasingly complex. While his leadership had brought international recognition, modernization, and a unifying vision for Africa, it also faced mounting criticism from within. Selassie's centralized rule, combined with socio-economic disparities and the slow pace of reforms, began to stir discontent among various sectors of Ethiopian society. One of the most significant challenges to Selassie's governance was the issue of land ownership. Ethiopia's feudal system left the majority of rural populations working as tenants on land owned by a small elite class. These peasants were burdened by high taxes and rent, with little opportunity for upward mobility. Despite Selassie's attempts at land reform, his measures were limited and often failed to address the root causes of inequality. This discontent fueled unrest, particularly in rural areas where the majority of Ethiopians lived and worked. Another source of tension was the growing gap between the urban elite and the rural poor. Selassie's modernization efforts often focused on urban centers, leaving rural areas underdeveloped. Infrastructure, education, and healthcare improvements were unevenly distributed, leading to perceptions that the government favored urban elites over rural communities. These disparities created a sense of alienation among Ethiopia's rural population, further weakening the bond between the emperor and his people. Ethnic and regional tensions also posed challenges to Selassie's rule. Ethiopia's diverse population included numerous ethnic groups with distinct languages, cultures, and histories. Selassie's policy of centralization often sidelined regional identities, leading to grievances among groups who felt excluded from political power and decision-making. In regions like Eritrea, where cultural and political aspirations clashed with the central government's policies, demands for autonomy began to take root. The student movement emerged as a vocal force of opposition in the 1960s and 1970s. University students in Addis Ababa and other urban centers began to challenge the monarchy, calling for land reform, greater political freedoms, and social justice. Influenced by Marxist ideologies and global liberation movements, they criticized Selassie's government as archaic and oppressive. Protests, strikes, and demonstrations became increasingly common, with students demanding systemic change and an end to feudal exploitation. The Ethiopian military also became a focal point of dissent. While Selassie had invested heavily in modernizing the armed forces, the military became disillusioned with his leadership. Low wages, poor living conditions, and corruption within the ranks fueled dissatisfaction. Young officers in particular were drawn to revolutionary ideologies that promised equality and social reform. This brewing discontent within the military would later play a pivotal role in the events that led to the emperor's downfall. Haile Selassie's response to dissent was often characterized by a combination of repression and reform. He used his authority to suppress uprisings, imprisoning activists and silencing critics. However, he also introduced measures aimed at addressing grievances, such as the creation of student scholarships and promises of land redistribution. Despite these efforts, many saw his reforms as too little, too late, and his inability to address systemic issues eroded public confidence in his leadership. By the 1970s, Ethiopia faced a series of crises that further undermined Selassie's rule. A severe famine in the Wollo province highlighted the government's inability to respond effectively to the needs of its people. While the famine claimed tens of thousands of lives, reports of government mismanagement and indifference fueled anger and resentment. This humanitarian disaster exposed the vulnerabilities of Selassie's regime and became a rallying point for opposition groups. The growing chorus of dissent reflected broader frustrations with the centralized nature of Ethiopia's governance. Critics argued that Selassie's focus on maintaining his absolute authority stifled innovation and progress. They called for a more inclusive and participatory political system that could address the needs of Ethiopia's diverse population. These demands for change would soon culminate in a revolutionary movement that reshaped the country's political future. Despite the mounting challenges, Selassie remained a symbol of Ethiopia's independence and resilience for many. His efforts to modernize the nation and secure its place on the global stage were undeniable achievements. However, the deep-seated issues of inequality, corruption, and marginalization cast a shadow over his legacy, setting the stage for the dramatic events to come. The challenges of governance and dissent during Haile Selassie's later years underscored the complexities of leading a diverse and rapidly changing nation. As the pressures on his regime intensified, the emperor's ability to adapt and respond to the evolving demands of his people was increasingly called into question. These tensions would ultimately converge in a pivotal moment that reshaped Ethiopia's history. Part 13. The Ethiopian Revolution. The 1970s marked a turning point in Ethiopia's history, as years of growing dissent and unresolved issues culminated in a full-scale revolution. Haile Selassie, once revered as a unifying leader, now faced opposition from multiple fronts. The Ethiopian Revolution, which began in 1974, was fueled by a combination of political, social, and economic grievances that spanned across the nation. One of the primary triggers of the revolution was the famine that struck Ethiopia in the early 1970s. In provinces like Wollo, thousands of people died from starvation, while reports of government negligence and corruption sparked outrage. The stark contrast between the suffering of the rural poor and the perceived extravagance of the monarchy created widespread disillusionment. Protesters accused Selassie's government of failing its people, with the famine becoming a symbol of broader systemic failures. Urban areas also became hotbeds of unrest as students, workers, and the middle class joined the call for change. Strikes, protests, and demonstrations swept through cities like Addis Ababa. Students, emboldened by revolutionary ideologies, demanded land reform, economic justice, and an end to feudal exploitation. Workers, frustrated by low wages and poor working conditions, formed unions and organized strikes, adding to the growing wave of discontent. The military, once a pillar of Haile Selassie's regime, emerged as a key player in the revolution. Low-ranking officers and enlisted soldiers were deeply dissatisfied with their treatment, citing low pay, poor living conditions, and lack of opportunities for advancement. Revolutionary ideologies began to spread within the armed forces, and disillusioned soldiers became increasingly vocal in their demands for change. In February 1974, a mutiny by soldiers in the town of Exile marked the beginning of a broader military uprising. The revolutionary movement gained momentum as various groups coalesced around a shared desire to overthrow the monarchy. In June 1974, the Derg, a committee of military officers, was formed to represent the armed forces and coordinate revolutionary activities. Initially, the Derg portrayed itself as a reformist body seeking to address the country's problems while preserving order. However, as its power grew, the Derg became increasingly assertive, positioning itself as the leading force in the revolution. By late 1974, the situation in Ethiopia had reached a breaking point. Haile Selassie, who had ruled the nation for over 4 decades, was losing his grip on power. On September 12, 1974, the Derg officially deposed Selassie, bringing an end to his reign. The announcement was met with a mix of jubilation and uncertainty, as Ethiopians grappled with the implications of this monumental change. Following his removal from power, Selassie was placed under house arrest in Addis Ababa. The once mighty emperor, who had stood as a symbol of Ethiopian independence and resilience, now faced a starkly different reality. The Derg moved quickly to consolidate its authority, abolishing the monarchy and declaring Ethiopia a socialist state. The revolution marked the end of centuries of imperial rule and ushered in a new era of governance. The Ethiopian Revolution was marked by a profound sense of upheaval and transformation. Long-standing institutions were dismantled, and the country embarked on a radical path of socialist reform. The Derg nationalized land, industries, and banks, promising to redistribute wealth and address the inequalities that had plagued Ethiopia under the monarchy. However, the transition was far from smooth, as internal conflicts and external pressures created significant challenges. For Haile Selassie, the revolution represented a dramatic reversal of fortune. Once hailed as a hero of resistance and a champion of modernization, he now faced widespread criticism and blame for the country's problems. His legacy became a subject of intense debate, with some viewing him as a flawed leader who failed to address Ethiopia's pressing needs, while others continued to revere him as a symbol of national pride and resilience. The Ethiopian Revolution marked the end of an era and the beginning of a tumultuous chapter in the nation's history. It reflected the deep-seated frustrations and aspirations of a society grappling with change, inequality, and the promise of a better future. While Haile Selassie's reign had left an indelible mark on Ethiopia, the revolution underscored the limits of his leadership in addressing the complexities of a rapidly evolving nation. The fall of Haile Selassie and the rise of the Derg represented a seismic shift in Ethiopia's political landscape. It was a moment of both hope and uncertainty, as Ethiopians sought to redefine their identity and chart a new course for the future. The legacy of the revolution and its impact on Ethiopia's history remains a topic of reflection and debate to this day. Part 14. Haile Selassie's Legacy. The fall of Haile Selassie marked the end of an era in Ethiopia, but his legacy continued to shape the nation long after his deposition. Despite the challenges of his reign, Selassie is remembered for his significant contributions to Ethiopian identity, modernization, and international diplomacy. His leadership left a lasting impact not just on Ethiopia, but on Africa as a whole, as he became a symbol of resistance, independence, and progress for many across the continent. One of Selassie's most enduring legacies is his role in the Pan-African movement. He was a staunch advocate for African unity and independence, believing that the continent's future lay in collective cooperation rather than division. As the only African monarch to address the League of Nations, Selassie made a passionate plea for the sovereignty of African nations, setting the tone for the decolonization movements that would follow in the coming decades. His efforts culminated in his role in founding the Organization of African Unity, OU, in 1963, which aimed to promote unity, peace, and economic cooperation among African nations. Selassie's advocacy for African unity resonated beyond his time as emperor. His vision of a united, independent Africa inspired subsequent generations of African leaders and revolutionaries, including figures like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. The OAU became a key organization in Africa's post-colonial political landscape, and Selassie's influence was integral in shaping its founding principles. Even after his fall from power, his commitment to pan-Africanism was a touchstone for those fighting for justice, sovereignty, and unity on the continent. In Ethiopia, Haile Selassie's legacy is viewed with a mix of admiration and criticism. For many, he is remembered as a father of the nation who brought Ethiopia into the modern world. His investment in education, infrastructure, and healthcare helped lay the foundation for future development. The creation of Addis Ababa University, as well as his reforms in education and healthcare, are viewed as significant achievements that contributed to Ethiopia's intellectual and cultural growth. However, Selassie's legacy is also marked by the critiques of his centralized rule and the economic inequality that persisted under his regime. His failure to fully address the needs of Ethiopia's rural population, coupled with the slow pace of political reform, contributed to growing disillusionment with his leadership. The revolution of 1974, which ousted him from power, reflected deep frustrations with his inability to navigate the complexities of governance in a rapidly changing world. In the Rastafarian movement, Haile Selassie is revered as a messianic figure, symbolizing the hope for liberation and the return of African people to their homeland. The Rastafarians, who viewed Selassie as the earthly embodiment of God, saw his reign as a sign of divine providence for Africans worldwide. His coronation in 1930 was seen by many as a fulfillment of a biblical prophecy, and even after his fall, the Rastafarian movement continued to uphold his image as a spiritual leader. This global reverence for Selassie further solidified his place in the history of not just Ethiopia, but the wider African diaspora. Selassie's contributions to Ethiopia's international standing also remain a key aspect of his legacy. He was a prominent figure in global diplomacy, securing Ethiopia's place in international forums such as the United Nations and the League of Nations. His efforts to maintain Ethiopia's sovereignty, even when faced with external pressures like the Italian invasion, are remembered as a testament to his determination and leadership. Despite the challenges he faced, Selassie's commitment to preserving Ethiopia's independence left a profound impression on both Ethiopian and international political thought. The Ethiopian Revolution, which removed him from power, ultimately reshaped his legacy, turning him from a beloved monarch into a controversial historical figure. For some, his fall represents the failure of an idealistic leader who struggled to adapt to the changing needs of his people. For others, Selassie remains a symbol of strength, vision, and resilience, whose contributions to Ethiopia's modernization and pan-africanism continue to inspire admiration and respect. Haile Selassie's legacy is a complex and multifaceted one, shaped by his accomplishments, his challenges, and the changing political landscape of the 20th century. His reign marked both a period of progress and an era of deep contradictions, and his legacy continues to spark debate, reflection, and analysis in Ethiopia and around the world. His story, like the nation he led, is one of transformation, perseverance, and ultimately, change. Part 15. The End of an Era. The final chapter of Haile Selassie's life was marked by personal and political upheaval, a dramatic conclusion to his reign that left an indelible imprint on Ethiopian history. After being deposed in 1974, Selassie's life was reduced to one of confinement and uncertainty. Under house arrest in Imperial Palace, the emperor's once glorious rule faded into a quiet existence far removed from the power and influence he had once wielded. His physical and emotional decline reflected the broader shift in Ethiopia's political landscape as the revolutionaries moved to consolidate their control and reshape the nation in their own image. Selassie's removal from power signified not just the end of his reign, but the collapse of an entire system of governance that had been in place for centuries. His removal from the throne symbolized the failure of a monarchy to adapt to the changing socio-political realities of Ethiopia and the world at large. The political vacuum left by the overthrow of Selassie was quickly filled by the Derg, a Marxist military junta, which led to the establishment of a socialist regime under the leadership of Mengistu Haile Mariam. As the Derg pursued its revolutionary agenda, Selassie's fate became a matter of increasing concern for both Ethiopians and the international community. Despite the critical political changes, Haile Selassie's presence still loomed large in the minds of many Ethiopians, particularly those who revere him as a symbol of national pride and independence. His position in the global imagination remained strong, especially within the Rastafarian movement, which viewed him not only as a political figure, but as a spiritual leader of immense significance. Selassie's last years were marked by his health deterioration, and his death in 1975 was shrouded in mystery. Official reports stated that he died of natural causes, but many suspected foul play, with some suggesting that the Derg had played a role in his demise. His death came only a year after his removal from power, but his legacy endured, continuing to shape Ethiopia's political discourse even as the country navigated its new socialist direction. In the aftermath of his death, the Derg solidified its rule, and Ethiopia was officially declared a People's Democratic Republic in 1987 under a constitution that abolished the monarchy forever. The transition to socialism brought new challenges and conflicts, including devastating famine, civil war, and widespread repression. However, for many, the loss of Haile Selassie marked the end of an era, one that had brought Ethiopia both moments of glory and profound trials. Haile Selassie's impact on Ethiopia and the world extended beyond his reign, remaining central to discussions of leadership, modernity, and national identity. His contributions to the Pan-Africa movement, his role in the modernization of Ethiopia, and his symbolic significance in global movements like Rastafarianism left a complex legacy. In Ethiopia, as well as across Africa and the diaspora, Selassie's memory continues to evoke a deep sense of respect, admiration, and controversy. In the decades following his death, Ethiopia underwent further turmoil, with the Derg eventually losing power to the forces of Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, EPRDF, in 1991. Despite the turbulence of the times, Haile Selassie's vision of a united, independent, and modern Ethiopia remains a key point of reflection for successive generations. Whether viewed as a monarch who failed to meet the needs of his people or as a visionary who was undone by forces beyond his control, Selassie's place in Ethiopian history is secure. The end of Haile Selassie's reign marked the conclusion of the imperial system that had defined Ethiopia for centuries. However, his legacy, both admired and criticized, remains deeply entrenched in the consciousness of Ethiopians and the wider African community. Haile Selassie's journey from emperor to exile, from visionary to symbol, encapsulates the complexities of leadership and the profound impact that historical figures can have on the course of nations. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.